If there's one thing that you know about me, it's that I love me some good old fantasy. Hi guys, welcome back to another video. I'm so happy that you're all here. I'm so happy that you're joining me to listen about all of my fantasy recommendations. So, you want to read fantasy? Well, I've got some recommendations for you. Maybe you're coming from a romance background. Maybe you're coming from a literary fiction background and you're thinking, hey, I need some more dragons. I need some more magic. I need some more fae in my life. Well, I'm gonna give you a very specific reading order of if I were to start reading fantasy now, never having read it before, this is the way that I think you should read it. And the way that I would read it if I were in your shoes, were I to go back in time. So you may be thinking, Kate, what makes you an expert in this? Why am I listening to your opinion? And honestly, maybe you shouldn't, because I'm not an expert. I just do really like fantasy. I read a lot of it. I have read a lot of it since high school. I grew up reading the Mortal Instruments. Harry Potter is my bread and butter. That's who created who I am today. And since then I have blossomed. And now I read more. And really, I just want to be recommending some of my favorite fantasy books for you to read, but I really do think that this is a good reading order to get into fantasy. So let's dive in. So like I said, this is gonna be in the order of, this is the exact order that I would read all of these books if I were to start out. So I'm starting off with some easier, some lighter fantasies, less world building. And I think a good place to start with that is young adult fantasy. Now I know that some people get a little nervous when you hear the word young adult because young adult romance sometimes feels like it's way too young to be read if you are a new adult or an older adult. And you know, you're right, young adult can be a little bit juvenile, but I find that young adult fantasy is a little bit different because you're not so focused on how old these characters are. It's not like these characters are going to high school. They're in a completely different world. They just happen to be younger characters. So I think sometimes when I read young adult fantasy, it doesn't feel like I'm reading young adult fantasy. It feels like I'm reading new adult fantasy. But the difference is just that the characters are a little bit younger. It doesn't really take away from the plot at all. It just makes it a little bit easier to understand as you're going, because it is written for a bit of a younger audience, but that makes it a really good place to be starting when you're reading fantasy. So that being said, my number one read from last year is actually the first place that I would say to start on this, and that is to start by reading The Divine Rivals duology by Rebecca Ross. Divine Rivals, like I said, this was my favorite book last year, and I'm not a big young adult reader. I don't like young adult romance, barely ever reach for young adult because I don't always connect with it. This book was so good, and it's now a completed duology. So you can go into this knowing that you're not having to wait for any books. It is not a long series to get into. Some of these future series that I'm going to touch on are a lot longer, and this would just be a really great starting point. It kind of feels like a historical fantasy. So this might be a good point to start. If you are a historical romance reader, I think the transition into these books would be really, really nice because you're getting a lot of the same feelings in these books, but it's just the writing is so lyrical and beautiful. The romance in this is just exquisite. The way that these two people interact, there's lots of letters and things as well, which I am a sucker for a good letter or text or anything like that in a book. It just makes it that much better. Just put a letter in a book and I'm gonna read it. I'm gonna love it. So I definitely recommend starting with these books. I truly cannot recommend them enough. I will be reading these books again, and I actually gave it to some of my family members for Christmas, and my mom was reading this and she thought, wow, this is actually a really enjoyable book. I also have a sister who's 16, and she thought, well, you know what, that's gonna be a really good book for her as well. So it's really a book that hits at any age. So I loved it, my mom loved it, and I'm sure my sister will love it as well. That's number one on the list. The next one is also a young adult fantasy. This one I put a little lower on the list, even though it's still a pretty straightforward world to get into, but it's not a completed series. Only the first book is out so far, and that is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This book I loved, and again, I think if you're coming from a romance reading kind of background, you will really love this book. It does have quite a bit of fantasy elements to it, but it's very easy to understand. This one, it is a little bit longer. Most romance books are not going to be nearly as long as most fantasy books, so just kind of know going into this genre that it is a little bit of a commitment. You do generally have to think a little bit more. I should say, generally I'm a romantasy reader, so I think pretty much all of my recommendations are going to fall into that category. I do not read a lot of high fantasy, but I think regardless, if you're getting into fantasy, high fantasy is probably not where you want to start because they have a lot of characters, it's a lot of world building, very difficult to follow. I've tried reading some high fantasy that I just simply could not follow. I could not remember who was the lord of where and what all the interactions between the people. So I think romantasy is a really good starting point, and young adult romantasy is even better as a starting point, and that's what this is. So this one, it kind of gives Hunger Games, there's trials in it. There's awesome tension between the two main characters in this book. And essentially, one of them has powers, one of them doesn't have powers in this world. If you don't have powers, that is really frowned upon and you could be executed. And then you get the romance between these two characters, so it's really well done. The second book in the series is coming out later this year. I think it's just gonna be a trilogy, so I think there will just be 3, which is really awesome because it's not gonna be a super long series, so you will have to wait for future books to come out, but it's not so intimidating. All right, so now you've made it through 2 young adult fantasy series, or at least part of 2, because the Powerless one is not all the way out yet, but at least you've touched on those. So now you're ready to get into a little bit more fantasy, a little bit more world building. So we're entering new adult fantasy now, where I still think that this next series is pretty easy to understand. You might have to think a little bit more. And I do always recommend, if you're starting out and you think you're meeting characters or there's world building points that you think you might forget, literally write it down. Or put a tab on the page where you meet the character so you can just quickly flip back and jog your memory of, oh, this is what this is. So the next series that I'm gonna recommend, I can't do this video without recommending this series, and that is the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J Maas. So the first book of that is A Court of Thorns and Roses. It's kind of made up of a trilogy, and then Sarah J Maas started adding new books to that. So what that's gonna look like is you have this completed trilogy, which is A Court of Thorns and Roses, A Court of Mist and Fury, and A Court of Wings and Ruin. These books, essentially, you could just read these books and finish the series here. They are long books. The first one is not, but after that, they get to be very, very hefty. The first 2 are very much romantasy based, so you're gonna get a lot of the romance comes out in these books. And then the third one is where you really start to see the plot develop more and that world building and the politics really come more into play in this third book. So you get a taste of both. The third book was my favorite book. A lot of people say that the second one is their favorite book, and it comes a close second for me. I did really like this book. But if you like romance, you're probably gonna like these 2 more. Well, maybe not the first one. If you know, you know. You might like it and then hate it, I don't know. So then, okay, now you've read these 3 books, you've really enjoyed them because everybody really enjoys them. So then Sarah J Maas decided, hey, we're gonna continue this series. So she put out a novella. This is called what is it called? A Court of Frost and Starlight. This is like a Christmas special. This is a very short book. I think it's around 300. No, it's way under 300. It's like a little over 200 pages. And this shows you where the characters are now after all the events of the first 3 books. And it kind of sets the scene for what's going to be happening in future books. Great. So now we have one of those future books, which is A Court of Silver Flames. This book is, I think, the longest out of all of them. This is a very hefty book, but this follows a different main character than the other trilogy did. It's somebody that you know from the other trilogy, but it is a new character, and it kind of sets the scene for this new plot that is developing. This book out of all of them is the most spicy. So I think if you're not somebody that's really into spice in books, you might just want to read the first 3 books. There still is a little bit of spice in those books, but this is the one where you're reading it and it's like every other chapter you're seeing something happen. So if that's something that you're uncomfortable with, or you just don't like seeing books, you can totally stop before that. But there are gonna be more books that come after this. I think there might be 2 more in the works that Sarah J Maas has announced, but I can't say that for certain. So A Court of Thorns and Roses series, that is the 3rd series that you're going to dive into. This is going to take you a bit of time because there are so many books. I wish I could say that it was completed, but unfortunately it's not. However, if you just want to read the first 3 books, then it kind of would be completed. The next books that I'm going to talk about is another completed duology. So now we're still, I think this is still not young adult, new adult fantasy that we're getting into. This is a series that, or duology, I guess, that I read this year and I absolutely fell in love with. And it's awesome because not one book is better than the other. I think they're both equally as good. So you can get into this duology knowing that the second book isn't gonna let you down, or you have to get through the first book to get to the really good second book, which is so great. And that is going to be the One Dark Window series by Rachel Gillig. So like I said, completed duology, very reasonably sized. This one is a little heavier on the fantasy, a little lighter on the romance. So that's why I'm putting this kind of so far down the list, even though as far as looks go, it doesn't appear to be as intimidating because it is such a small series. It is just a little bit more fantasy. It has a super unique magic system in this series, and I've never read another book like it. I would thoroughly recommend it. It gives all of the vibes of like gloominess, kind of gothic fantasy. So I read these in the fall, and I would recommend doing the same, because when you're kind of already feeling like, oh, the leaves are coming off of the trees, everything is a little bit gloomy anyway, these just really feed into that atmosphere, and I really enjoyed them. I kind of wish that this was a longer series. And for me, I really like romance, so I do just wish that the romance was maybe a little bit heavier, just for my personal liking. But these are books that are still very beginner friendly, but you are just going to have to follow the plot a little bit more. It is multi-POV as well, so you're not just following one character's perspectives, which is the same as some of the previous books that I've mentioned, but I would say this one, you do just have to follow it a little bit more. Like I said, just awesome vibes in these books. I wish I could read these books for the first time again because they are just so good, phenomenal. I love that so many of these are completed at this point, and this one is not any different. This one is 2 books and a novella. It gained a lot of popularity this year, and honestly for a good reason, because it was very bingeable. I really enjoyed the writing of it, and that is going to be The Serpent and the Wings of Night series by Carissa Broadbent. So that starts with The Serpent and the Wings of Night, and then you read a novella called 6 Scorched Roses. You don't have to read this, but I would recommend it because it was actually a good little book. And then you have The Atchis and the Star-Cursed King. And then once you read those, you're all done. These ones are thick. They are big, big books. So this is where we start to get into a lot more of the fantasy politics, particularly in the second book. First book is another trials book, which I read a lot of trials books in this past year in 2023, and I really do like trials books. I think I'm getting a little bit tired at this point because I've seen it so much, and even though I really like it, I just want some things that are a little bit different at this point. But I did really like it. The trials only happen in the first book. In the second book, you don't see any of that. So the first book is mainly about those trials, but a lot of romance in it as well. And then the second book is a little less on the romance. It's still there, but it's a little bit less. And then you get a lot of politics. I find that that's kind of the trend in a lot of these books, is that they start heavier in the romance, and then as that romance is kind of solidified, it kind of tapers off, and then you get more of what's actually happening in the world and those politics and wars that are going on and things like that, which I like a good balance. I like them both. These were really good. Carissa is actually coming out with more books in this series, but they're kind of, I guess, kind of gonna be like interconnected standalone series in a way, because it's gonna focus on different characters, but I do think you would have to read this in order. Like, you would have to read these books before you read the other ones, but it's gonna be pretty disconnected. And I think I know who it's going to be around just based off of how the second book ended, but I'm not 100% certain. Again, there's lots of things that I don't know. Okay, we are jumping into a series where there's 2 books out so far. There's going to be, I believe, 5 in this series, so it's not completed at this point, which is unfortunate. This is a series, it took the world by storm this year. Everybody read this, and that is The Fourth Wing. The second book, Iron Flame, is also out at this point. This is so low on this list. Even though a lot of people read it, a lot of people were introduced to fantasy through this book, I did not think that this is a good starting point, because the first book is, if it was just the first book that was still out, I would say yes, this would be a lot higher on the list. this is a lot more romance heavy, and you're being introduced to the world, and you're being introduced to this character who is going through this school system, being trained to ride a dragon. And there's lots of really great things. The dragons are characters in this. They have personalities. I really did like this book. I didn't love it as much as a lot of people did, but I did really have a good time reading it. So if it was just this would probably be like number 2, number 3 on the list. However, Iron Flame came out late 2023, and this book I would not recommend for you to read right off the bat. Like, I think at this point down the list, you know, you've read some ACOTAR, you've read The Two Twisted Crowns, you're introduced to the fantasy at this point. So I think at this point, if you followed my list, you can start reading these books, that's fine. But this one it's very thick, first of all. There's a lot of words, and the words are very dense on the page. So this took me a long time to read. And I think if you are getting into fantasy and you aren't a committed reader, this could probably put you in a slump pretty easily. Romance is a lot lighter in this one. You don't see that as much as you do in Fourth Wing. And there's a lot more of the politics in this. Like, it's very, very politics heavy, which again, like, I do like, but I think as a beginner fantasy reader, it's not going to be something that is for you to ease you into the genre. So I wouldn't recommend jumping in this first, but I think if you've read a couple different lighter fantasies, you can definitely jump into this, and I think you will enjoy it and you'll have a good time. But just keep that in mind, that the second book is probably going to be a little bit overwhelming. There is a lot of characters, a lot of things going on. Just know that and be prepared for that, okay? Last on this list is a completed series, but it is 8 books long. And I put this as last on the list, not because it's not one of my favorite fantasy series, but because it is 8 books long. And it is going to be a massive time commitment. The books start off fairly small and then gradually get very, very long to almost 1,000 pages by the end of it. So you would not want to start with this as a beginner fantasy reader. That is the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. So this is the second series on this list by Sarah J. Maas that I have put on. She's a very popular writer, and for good reason. Her books are very interesting. The way that they are written, they are generally a little bit easier to understand. I find that the Throne of Glass series is a little bit more politics heavy than the ACOTAR series is. So I think that if you're going to be reading Sarah J. Maas's series in order, read the ACOTAR first to kind of dip your toes in, and I definitely would not push this right off the bat. I have not read Crescent City by her yet, or that series. I know the third one's coming out soon, but that is on my 2024 to be read list. But like, just look at this last book. Like, this one is nearly 1,000 pages long, and it's just massive. Like, you really don't want to go into this as a beginner reader. The way that the series starts is not the way that it develops into. A lot of series, you kind of see this linear path. Book 1 orients you, and then you see it slowly progress. And like, that definitely happens in this, but it's a totally different feeling series than the first book is. The first book, you really don't get a ton of fantasy, and then by the time you're later on in the series, it is a lot of fantasy. I actually haven't read the last book yet. I'm not finished the series, but I'm enjoying it enough that I want to recommend it. But this series, it's not for the faint of heart. It is a thoroughly enjoyable series. It is about Faye, and it's really just such a good story. Our main character is one of the best protagonists that I've ever read about. Just the way that her mind works, and like, her personality just really shines through. You really get to see who she is as a person at her soul. As we progress into the series, you're getting a lot of different points of view, which can be a little bit confusing. We have a lot of characters, a ton of characters, and they're all very interesting in their own way, but it's a lot to keep track of. It really is. And so that's why I would say start lighter. Start with series that are smaller, that are young adults, that are just going to be easy to digest, and then build up from there. So I really think that this is such a good, well-rounded list of exactly what you should do if you are entering fantasy. My disclaimer to it all is, like I said, I don't read a lot of high fantasy, so if that's something you're really interested in, maybe this isn't the list for you. Some of these books will be applicable to step your toes into fantasy regardless. If any of these sound good to you, if you have read any of these, let me know what you thought of them. If you agree with me that they're good beginner books. If there's something that you think that I missed that should be on this list, let me know, as maybe there's something that I didn't think of. There are some popular series that I purposely left out because I didn't enjoy them, but all of these series are series that I would recommend. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'm so glad that you're here, and I can't wait until I see you guys in the next video. You guys have a wonderful day. Goodbye.